Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple different reasons. First of all, just to allow my brain to move out of the background work over the course of the week as I'm working with the text and move into the process of writing and preparing the sermon that I'm going to preach to my congregation for the weekend. And the second reason I make these videos is just to allow you, the viewer who have come across it for whatever reason has brought you here today, to gain some different insight into the assigned gospel text for the week. So that's kind of why I do these. This particular Sunday, which is September 18th, 2016, the 18th Sunday after Pentecost. I think that's kind of cool that the 18th Sunday after Pentecost falls on the 18th. Don't know how often that actually happens, but it makes me think, hey, awesome. Our assigned gospel text for this week comes out of Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. Kind of an odd little passage, one that is tricky to say the least, a parable of Jesus, and one that offers a lot of head scratching. Self-professed. From a preaching standpoint, I don't always like parables. Sometimes I find them very, very tricky to try and figure out how do I preach this? What do I do with this? I oftentimes just find basic narrative to be easier. That's just a side note. But this one in particular is troublesome, to say the least. And I know that I'm not the only one who thinks that, because I've bumped into a lot of different things that I've read, commentaries, et cetera, that have kind of said the same thing. So with that being said, kind of where we're at in terms of overarching story, if you've kind of been following along, we have been in the travel narrative of Jesus for quite a while now. As he's moving towards Jerusalem, his face is turned towards Jerusalem. And it won't be a whole lot longer in terms of narrative wise before he gets there. But in the midst of all of this, Jesus is still teaching, traveling around. That's always his end destination, but he's still encountering a lot of different people and teaching as he goes. Chapter 15 was full of parables as well. We were in that last week, and we heard two of the three lost parables, parable of the lost coin and the parable of the lost sheep. The prodigal son, as it's better known or best known, is also a part of that, although we didn't have that in the assigned text. But that's all what's predating or preceding this particular reading that we're coming up to now. So basically, Jesus is still kind of teaching, still going along, still encountering different people, and then we come into this. So with that being said, let's dive in. And again, this one's a head scratcher. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what I will do, so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. Now here's the weird part. His master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into their eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you that which is yours to own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." Okay, so that's the teaching as a whole. A little bit of a translation situation. We keep hearing money or wealth. That's kind of how our later translations, or our more commonly used translations right now, word that. The word itself is mammon. And this is kind of an interesting little word. It's best described as dishonest wealth, although that in itself is kind of like, well, what's that mean? Mammon is actually a name given to wealth as an idol. And I don't know what the origin of that is. I've never kind of come across that information, but essentially it goes back to the notion of creating idols for ourselves or gods, little g, and giving it a name. Well, mammon is the name given to the idol of wealth. So when we place our faith in that wealth or in that money and all that we do is to appease that. That's what mammon is, and I will likely kind of try and lay that out for within the sermon because I think that's an important distinction to be aware of as we are looking at this parable. Now, in conversation about this parable over the course of the week, admittedly, as I've already mentioned, I really don't like this parable as a whole. In fact, I would probably go as far as to say that I hate this parable, not only from a preaching standpoint, but just in general. I do not like this parable. And probably, maybe it hits close to home. Maybe it is because it seems to be so utterly opposed to our American culture and our economy. That's kind of, this is how our economy works. It's not, I mean, it's not necessarily moral, but that's kind of how that's the norm for us. So maybe that's troublesome. Honestly, though, when it comes to the parable itself, not Jesus' description there in the later part, but the parable itself, a difficulty that I have with this is that the manager or the steward is dishonest, or he's actually the Greek, the unrighteous steward is what he's called, and he is commended for what he does by his master or by his Lord, who commends his unrighteousness. And that's the part that I really just kind of don't get. So the premise of this whole parable, I mean, it in itself, the parable is pretty straightforward. That there's a guy who he's a manager within a household for a rich guy, and so nothing that he is controlling is actually his. It all belongs to someone else. But he is the manager. So and he apparently really stinks at his job, so he's going to get fired, or he's getting fired, and he has no skills apparently, and doesn't know what to do. So basically, he's going to try and tweak things around so to improve his overall situation, so that when he gets fired and kicked out of the household, maybe he'll be accepted as a guest in the houses of somebody else, and so someone will take care of him. That's his whole premise. So he basically he screws over his soon-to-be former master by lowering the bills of his debtors. Now, I've read some different things that are saying that, well, as the steward, he would apply his own interest to them, and maybe that's what he's doing, is he's just cutting out the interest rates, so that the bill that the debtors owe is actually just the bill itself and not anything extra. Maybe, I don't know, but I struggle with this, just to kind of make sense of it. Now, perhaps Jesus' audience or Luke's audience, when the gospel was written, would have a better understanding of all this, and maybe that stuff is true, and they would kind of see that, and that would just kind of jump to them right away, and so they understand why the steward is being complimented for this. But I don't know. To me, it's just odd, and it's strange, and it's weird that he's commended for it. Now, what is he doing? The steward is trying to improve his own situation, but he still gets fired. He still gets kicked out eventually. So he's, if nothing else, he's softening the blow, but the blow still comes. And I'm kind of the direction that I'm thinking I'm going with this parable is that Jesus is reminding us that if we put all of our eggs in the basket of this is how the world works now, all we can do is soften the blows. But this is the best that we can expect. And we need to look and remember the eternal. We are serving God. We are serving the one who holds our eternal future in his hands. And that is the one that we need to serve. I mean, there's the whole stewardship aspect. There's a lot of different directions that we can go with this, and I'm not exactly sure where I'm going to go with it yet. But that's kind of what's going on in this parable. Again, it's troublesome. And maybe it would be